Okay, so hello everyone again, and welcome back. We were looking at, as you will remember, at electricity on Shabbos, and I think the final top area we need to look at was we had discussed various reasons for the prohibition of electricity. Basically, we had divided it into two scenarios: a scenario where a glowing filament is created, whether that's a heater in a filament in a heating element in a heater, or whether it's a glowing old-fashioned filament light bulb. That's what the Poskim originally spoke about. There's a clear Melacha of mevashal, metal, if cooking applies to metal, and mavir, creating a flame. A glowing red-hot wire is considered to be mavir, and we discussed those. That was the first round of Poskim. In the second round of Poskim, we're looking at electricity where it doesn't cause that. We said sparking is not a clear-cut issue either, even though creating a spark is a problem here. The spark is very short-lived, it's not intentional. Even in old-fashioned electrical appliances, which weren't about creating light or heat, even if the wire was becoming heated, it was certainly unintentional, it was certainly an unwanted side effect. It was just wasting the energy of the electricity on side things when really you want to get the product working. And certainly with modern devices, there's no heating or very little heating taking place in the wires. Anyway, especially when we're talking about microcircuitry and your phone and LED lighting, fluorescent lighting also. So what would be the melacha involved over there? We saw an issa drabanon of moiles, bringing something new, creating something new. Creating something new is drabanon, Rashi said, because it's like a melacha. It's korov lasis melacha chadasha. It's like a melacha. It's near to a melacha. It's not actually technically within the definition of melacha. And we saw that a very senior Pesak, Rabbi Tzachmelkas, the Beis Yitzchak, considered that to be the prohibition. And then we saw a very famous chazanish that the building of a circuit, the creation and completion of a circuit, is boina. And he also mentions Makkeh BePatish, incidentally. And then we saw it's the Shuvah of Moshe Feinstein, which made very difficult reading, and this is where we finished off. This was source 12 on the first handout sheet. Moshe Feinstein, where actually maybe if I can just draw your attention to these lines, he says a very, very interesting set of lines, and he doesn't really elaborate on what he means. So if you just have a quick look at source 12, if you have your first handout sheets, he gives a number of Isurim, but he's talking here answering a Rav of a shul who wants to know about introducing a microphone into his shul. And he says, if you look in base, space, so that's the third paragraph down in source 12, which begins with the letter base, point number 2. And listen to what he says, really strange and remarkable words. He says, first he says a scientific fact, based on the strength of the voice, the current varies, that's uncontroversial, that's a scientific fact. Based on his speech, he raises and lowers the circuitry, the level of electric flow, again, absolutely true. Microphone. He said you can see this actually measured if you attach an amp meter or a voltmeter. You can see how it varies as people speak. Lamisha wrote to Lashvos, if somebody wants to level their voice and working on pitch, they can use devices to show what's going on with the circuitry. Chelkeinu, therefore, he says, even when we don't attach this device, we know that his voice is causing the electric use of the device to go up and down. And therefore, he says crucial words. And when you speak with a loud voice, he calls the electrical consumption to be more. Using electrical forces, there's a risk of an issa deraisa. Really interesting words. It's possible that it's an issa deraisa Torah prohibition, af below havora, even without burning anything, even without heating the wire. V'yesh la'ayim b'zetuf v'lamaisim. This needs a lot of deeper investigation. And then he says, v'lechein boro. It's therefore obvious that you can't use. I'm sorry, I should have looked at Aleph. I'm sorry, I messed up. If you look in the last letters of the paragraph before, he says the similar thing. He says, this is the third last line of the paragraph before. He says there's a certain risk that there must be some melacha over here. Something is innovated. Through this you hear the loud voice. Maybe it's Makkeh BePatish, maybe it's boina. You have to research exactly which Melacha it is. There's a risk of an Issa Deraisa, even if you don't know exactly which prohibition it is. So to summarize, Moshe is saying something very strange. He says there's definitely a risk of a Deraisa over here. I can't put my finger on exactly which Melacha this is, but there's definitely a Melacha taking place, perhaps Boiner, like the Chazon Ish, perhaps Makkeh BePatish, which the Chazon Ish also alluded to, but there has to be some Melacha over here, and therefore this is a risk of Deraisa. So where does he get his certainty from that there's a Melacha, and what sort of talk is this for a Pesak, for any Pesak, no matter, the most senior of all, when Moshe Feinstein, to say there must be some issue over here, even though I don't know exactly what, maybe it's this, but it can't be allowed. What sort of halachic mechanism is that? When we go through the Lamatas Malachas, identify which one it is, and if it's none of them, then it's mutter. You can't just make up your own Isurim over here. So what is Ramosha saying? So to answer this question, I want us to look a little bit more with care at what Makkeh BePatish is, and also look at a very beautiful shuvah of Reb Asher Weiss, one of the living Poskim. So what is Makkeh BePatish? We discussed it last year a little bit, and we said that Makkeh BePatish means completing something, either bringing something into functionality, or the final stage in its, even though it could technically be used before, but the final thing that you do before using it. So I mentioned, blowing up maybe a flat pack balloon, a flat pack football. Maybe it's Makkeh BePatish because beforehand it was flat pack, now it's blown up. Do you all have the next source sheet, by the way, with the Shuvah of Asher Weiss? You have that? Yeah, excellent. Okay. Or it's, the last hammer blow that straightens out a silversmith, to straighten out a becher, a Kiddush cup that they're making. Or it could be where you have something that's usable, but you would finish it off before you use it. So two scenarios. The Gemara talks about buying a new sweater, a jumper, and the neck of the jumper is stitched shut in order to avoid it losing shape. And when you buy the jumper for the first time, you sort of unstitch the stitches. So that could be Korea, it could be another Melacha, but could also be Makkeh BePatish because it's not usable to be unstitched the stitches. And another scenario is when you buy a garment or you make a garment and it's usable, you can wear it, but you haven't yet cut off the little strings. When you weave something, you have the little strands of strings that are left over and you need to snip them off, and you haven't snipped them off. So in that case, you're not making something go from nothing to usability, but you're making it go into, practically speaking, how do people use it, finishing it off, tidying up the last strings, and that would also be Makkeh BePatish. Now, if you look at the next source sheet, there's a very, very strange Talmud. Sorry, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a quick question? So, from a practical Halachic perspective about tags taking off, so that's
okay.
It's not just added to the clothes, aside from the fact that it is a finished garment. Can you give 30 seconds on when you're allowed to remove a tag on Shabbos?
Okay, excellent. Yes. So first of all, the distinction you draw is exactly right. The reason why de-tagging a shop label off a garment is not Makkeh BePatish is because the garment was finished and then this label is something additional put there. So it's not analogous to slipping off the strings, and therefore that will not be Makkeh BePatish. What it might be is Korea or the opposite Malach of Tofa. In other words, the label is stitched and I'm unstitching it, and therefore that could be a problem. Generally speaking, the labels which are just attached with a plastic tag, sort of little plastic thin wire which holds it on, generally is not a problem to de-tag it on Shabbos. And the reason is because it's designed to be taken off, it's not permanent, it's destructive, it's a negative Melacha, and it's only one stitch that's taking place, and therefore for a combination of reasons it would be allowed. If it's a label that's properly sewn on, one should not detach on Shabbos, but not because of Makkeh BePatish again, but because of the Melacha of Korea.
So something like if the pockets are sewn, even if it's with one or two stitches, to undo them, that could be a problem of Makkeh BePatish because it was put in the garment. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this is
just one other question. Just if it's a more simple item with just a tag on it, you can remove the tag without many problems. But what if it's, for example, like a packet of socks and they're all tagged together to hold them together? So in theory, you wouldn't be able to use them unless you had removed the tags. Does that carry any alternatives.
I don't think that's a problem there also, because it's just one stitch holding them together and they're designed to be taken apart, and the same leniencies would apply. I'll tell you what is Makkeh BePatish, a more modern scenario, and I've seen caterers do this, is chopsticks. So wooden chopsticks are stuck together, and I've seen them going out in simchas, and people detach them, and that's mamish Makkeh BePatish min haTorah. That's a Melacha d'oraisa, because they are manufactured partially still connected. And when you detach them, you're completing you're making them useful. So that's a terrible scenario of literally Melacha d'oraisa on Shabbos. So yeah, that would certainly be a problem. Okay, so that's Makkeh BePatish. We're not learning in full all the details of Makkeh BePatish now, but that's just a sample of them. But what we are going to do is see a teshuvah of Reb Asher Weiss, where he applies the principles of Makkeh BePatish to the use of electricity and gives us an indication of what this sort of hesitant suggestion of Makkeh BePatish might mean in the Chazon Ish and in the Ramesh Feinstein, who are obviously much more senior Poskim than him. And let's learn together the top of source 2, in which I printed the Rambam. The Rambam says, Kol davar shu gemar melacha, anything which is the completion of melacha, chayav of mishum Makkeh BePatish. You're chayav because of Makkeh BePatish, one of the 39 melachas. Or because of this, hagara kol shehu, if you gora is where you sand something or plane something. In other words, you have wood which isn't entirely smooth, and you run a plane or sandpaper across it to smooth it out. Or you fix something in any way in which it needs fixing, you're chayav. So that's the classic definition of Makkeh BePatish. If we jump to source 3, the Rambam says something amazing. So someone has a boil, a sore, an infected spot on their body, and the doctor decides, or they decide to open it, to pop the boil, not just to drain the pus for a moment, but to create a wide enough opening that will stay for a little while, so that the sore can drain and dry out fully itself. So someone who pops a boil on Shabbos, but not just popping it so it will drain out now, but to widen the opening of the wound, so they have an infected wound or the like, in the way that doctors do. They intend in the healing process to widen the mouth of the wound. They're obligated, they're chayav. This means d'oraisa min haTorah. This is transgression of Makkeh BePatish. Shezuhi melechas harofa, because this is the melacha, the work of a doctor. So this statement of the Rambam is completely incomprehensible. The Rambam says that it is Makkeh BePatish to open a wound up in order to allow the wound to seep, to drain and dry. Why? Because this is the job of doctors. What on earth does that sequence of words mean? So that's source 3. And the Rambam is very, very difficult to understand. Again, I mean, in the interest of intellectual honesty, the Rambam, like so many other Rambams, is based on the Gemara, but he gives the Gemara his own unique spin and his own unique interpretation. So we're not learning these halachos. I won't show you the source of what the Gemara says and how the Rambam is interpreting it. But however, the background to this halacha, this is what the Rambam says, and the Rambam seems to say that creating an opening in a wound is Makkeh BePatish. How on earth does it fit any normal definition of Makkeh BePatish, as we saw in source 1, which is the classic location where the Rambam defines Makkeh BePatish. The next source I want to see is another amazing source. It's a Talmud Yerushalmi, It's a Gemara Yerushalmi Talmud. So again, maybe just indicate, are you aware fully of the history of the creation of the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi? Is that something you've ever covered, or should I just give a quick overview of that?
If you could do a quick overview, that would
be. So basically, the background is that around 270 years into the Common Era, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was a descendant of Hillel and ultimately a descendant of the royal family of David HaMelech, completed a collation project in which he collected all the statements of the Tanoim for the last 400, 500 years before him, and edited them into what we call the Mishnah. So for various reasons, we don't know an enormous amount about certain time periods in the second Beis Hamikdash. but somewhere around 100 years before the Common Era, or 170 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, a group of named rabbinic leaders began emerging, who began teaching us statements of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and these are the earliest Tanoim. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi collated all these statements and traditions going back from, as I said, about 200 years, 170 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, through to about 200 years after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, so a period of about 400 plus years. And this whole period of rabbinic teaching is what we call the Tanoim, the era of the Mishnah, and he collated them all into a collection which became the primary collection of the Torah of the Tanoim, which is what we call the Mishnah. The reason he did so was because he was worried about the loss of Torah teachings due to the Roman persecution, and he had the opportunity to do so because he was the recognized leader. He was called Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. He was his family of David. He was recognized by the Jews as his leader. He was personally wealthy, so he had enough resources to embark on this project and, as far as we understand, build a team around him to produce this mammoth task of collection of all the Tanaitic statements. And also he got on well with the Roman civil authorities. He was friendly with someone called Antony, who was either the Roman emperor or the consul, the local ruler, and because of that had a time of peace, and he collated the Mishnah. There were other collections of Tanaitic statements made. So, for example, his nephew, Rabbi Shiur, collected all the many statements into a work called the Tosefta, not the Tosus, which is a commentary on the Gemara, but another collection of Tanaitic statements called the Tosefta. Other works of collection of Tanaitic statements were made, including various Medrashim, Medrashei Halacha, the Sifra, the Sifri. So lots and lots of collections of Tanaitic statements were made. All of these collections are together known as Brisa, external collections. So we have the Mishnah, which is the main volume of collections. Then we have the Brisa, which is all the other types of collections made that never achieved the same authority as the Mishnah. So that provides the structure of Torah Sheba'al Peh as things stood more or less by the end of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's life. And you had the primary canonical collection of statements of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the Mishnah. And then you had other collections of Torah Sheba'al Peh like the Sifra, the Sifri, Teras Kohanim, various Medrashim, the Tosefta, which are known as the Brisa. So that's the collections. After the conclusion of the Mishnah and the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the next generation of leaders began engaging in discussing the Mishnah. And the discussion primarily, if you ask what is Gemara, it's a recording of the discussions that took place in the Batei Medrash for a period of another roughly 300 years. And in this time, they engaged in various discussions. They discussed, number one, halachic areas that weren't covered in the Mishnah and the Brisa. Number two, they discussed the meaning of Mishnah. What does Mishnah mean? Sometimes Mishnah is phrased unclearly. Number three, they discussed scenarios within halacha, cases that the Mishnah does discuss, but it doesn't necessarily give every detail of those halachas. Number four, they discussed where did the Mishnah derive its laws from. When Rabbi X said A and Rabbi Y said B, where did they get their opinions from? What's the rationale of the basis of their halachic discussion? Number six, they engaged in discrepancies and contradictions within the Mishnah itself. And number seven, they engaged with discrepancies and contradictions between the Mishnah and the other Tanaitic collections, the Mishnah and the Brisa. So even though they granted senior authority, canonical status to the Mishnah and less to the Brisa, they still wanted to resolve contradictions and inconsistencies between these sources. So that basically was the enormous project of the Gemara, and that's how Gemara built up. Now, there were two main centers of Torah Jewry at the time. One was in Eretz Israel, in the north of Israel, basically around the Galil area, Tveria, and these sorts of regions. And the second Torah center was in Bovel, where there were several yeshivas, Surah and Pompedisa, Nadar, and so on and so forth. Both of these centers began embarking on the project of trying to analyze the Mishnah in the ways that I just explained. And there was communication between these two great Torah centers because of travel that took place. There was communication backwards and forwards. In both of these centers, they began collating their discussions. However, the collation that took place in Eretz Israel was cut to a shortened end, an abrupt halt, due to persecution. And Eretz Israel was ruled by the Romans, and the Romans tightened their grip and impoverished the Jewish settlement in Israel, in the Galil. and stopped the collation project of the Talmud Yerushalmi. As a result, we have one collection of discussions called the Talmud Yerushalmi, which really means the Eretz Yisrael Gemara, which wasn't edited fully, and the discussions were cut short. The issues weren't fully fleshed out, and therefore it's a briefer, less comprehensive, harder to understand, and less authoritative Gemara. In Bovel, meanwhile, which was ruled by the Persians, the situation was much better. The Jewish community flourished, and the work of learning Gemara continued. And therefore, the Talmud Bavli, which is a collection of the discussions that took place around the Mishnah, is much better edited, much clearer, easier to understand, more comprehensive, and treated as more authoritative. The Bavli also has senior authority over the Yerushalmi because the Bavli knew of many of the traditions of the Yerushalmi. It's not clear whether the Talmud Bavli had the hot access to the whole Yerushalmi, but they definitely knew of many of the discussions in the Yerushalmi, because they certainly received some of the traditions from Eretz Yisrael, brought over by travelers or by refugees who arrived from Eretz Yisrael where things were very difficult to Bovel and went to Bovel where things were easier. So basically, to summarize, the Torah tradition in Eretz Yisrael, by and large, came to an abrupt halt about 150 years after the end writing the Mishnah, whereas in Bovel it carried on for another 100 years beyond that, and therefore the Talmud, the Yerushalmi, is less authoritative, less learned, has less halachic weight, is harder to understand, and is less clear than the Talmud Bavli. So these are the two Talmud collections we have. Primarily, we learn the Talmud Bavli, that's where all the commentaries are written, and that's where our halachic sources arrive from. When we discuss Pesak, and I know I haven't yet done the source sheets with you on Pesak, when we discuss Pesak, basically the Talmud Bavli has the last word on matters. Nonetheless, the Talmud Yerushalmi often adds little nuggets that the Talmud Bavli doesn't make clear, and sometimes it clarifies discussions in the Talmud Bavli that aren't entirely clear, and the Talmud Yerushalmi makes it clearer. So Talmud Yerushalmi has source and authority and a power to it that the Talmud Bavli has a source and authority the Talmud Yerushalmi doesn't have, but nonetheless the Talmud Yerushalmi adds insight. The final thing I will say is that it is misnamed the Talmud Yerushalmi. It was not produced in Yerushalayim. Jews were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim at that part. The Romans had made Yerushalayim Judenfrei. It was free of, unfortunately, free of Jews. Jews were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim. The Jews were living in the Galil. So accurately, it should probably be called Talmud Galili or the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, Talmud Eretz Yisraeli. The Bavli, when it refers to discussions in Eretz Yisrael, it calls it the Marava in the west, because Israel is to the west of Iraq, where Bavel is, if you think about your map. So it shouldn't really be called Talmud Yerushalmi, it should be called the Western Talmud or Talmud Eretz Yisrael. But either way, that's the background to the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, the figures who flourish in the Talmud Yerushalmi, by the way, the Talmud Yerushalmi is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because they were speaking Aramaic in Eretz Yisrael at the time also. They had stopped. The spoken tongue, by and large, was Aramaic, and therefore it's written in Aramaic. And many of the very famous figures, including Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, are Talmud Yerushalmi Amoraim. They lived in Eretz Yisrael. They are recorded in the Talmud Yerushalmi, but as I said, many of the traditions came over to Bavel, and therefore we also have the Bavli quoting Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish extensively. Just before I go further, are any of you aware of the character of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan? Do you know the story of their lives? Is this something you're familiar with? Yeah, okay, so I won't tell you about them as people. Reish Lakish as the ex-bandit chief, is that something you're familiar with? Yeah, Reish Lakish is the ex-bandit chief. Yeah, you know about that or not? But okay, so I won't tell you the story. So let's have a look at source 2, the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi Masechus Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Avdin Havi Ahadei Pirka Talas Shemin or Ploig. So again, if you know the story of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, you will know they were chavrusas, they were study partners. This is on handout 2, source 2. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Avdin Havi Ahadei Pirka. They learned this chapter, the 7th chapter of Shabbos, Talas Shemin or Ploig, 3.5 years. Basically, what that means to say is, as I said, they were chavrusas, they were study partners, and for 3.5 years. They learnt the laws of the Melachos of Shabbos. That's what the 7th chapter of Shabbos is about. It's about the Lamates Melachos, 39 Melachos. Afkun minei arbayin chosa achas toldos al kol chadar v'chadar. They drew out 39 toldos, subcategories of Melachos, from each of the 39 others, each of the 39 primary categories. So we know we have 39 others Melachos. They have subcategories, toldos. So I don't know, I'm not allowed to sew on Shabbos, that's the Av, and I'm not allowed to glue pieces of paper together, that's the Toldot, that's the subcategory. I'm not allowed to plant a seed in the ground on Shabbos or plant a sapling in the ground on Shabbos, that's the Avot Melacha, because I'm causing growth to occur. I'm not allowed to water a seed or prune a tree on Shabbos, which is another way of engendering growth of things on Shabbos, that's the Toldot. Now, both the Avos and Toldot are min HaTorah, just their ways of categorizing the Melachas. The Avos Melachas are the 39 categories, and within them, there's subcategories. And there's various distinctions between whether something is a category or subcategory, but basically they're all awesome in HaTorah. The Talmud Yeshanim makes the wonderful and incredible statement that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai derived 39 subcategories to each of the Avos Melachas. Quick maths question for you. If there's 39 subcategories to each of the Avos Melachas, what's 39 squared? How many categories are there in total? Any mathematical geniuses here? Okay, 1,521. Okay, so if you want to know all the Avos and Toldot, you have to know 1,521. That's the Melachas. Okay, so far all very, very interesting. Let's finish off though the last line of this Yerushalmi. This is really important. Min to ashkecham, those that they could find, difficult words to translate, those that they could find as a Melacha, mismach somchin, they would lean them on one of the others. Harden loy ashkecham, those who they couldn't find, mismach avdunahu, they would attach or rely this Melacha and prohibit it, mishum Makkeh BePatish, because of the Melacha of Makkeh BePatish. So there's an enormous amount that we need to unpick in this. We're not going to learn through the whole teshuvah of Reb Asher Weiss, but I just want to learn through a few points in it, and then I want to explain to you what Reb Asher Weiss says, and this will be combined with what my own Rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Soloveitchik, under whom I had the enormous privilege to learn, said around this topic. They actually, very interesting, Reb Asher Weiss comes from a very different style of learning to my Rabbi. My Rabbi is a Brisker, Mammon Soloveitchik, so Reb Asher Weiss is a Hungarian Pesak who deals with Halacha in a very different way. In this respect, they say something very similar. But first, just read the opening lines of the teshuvah of Reb Asher Weiss. I mean, he anonymizes who he's writing to. He's writing to someone who wrote an article, a Torah piece around electricity. And just look at his opening words. This is the middle of page 1. I couldn't trace him to I received the pamphlets that he sent me. The alien ani maskim, I don't agree. Of lola mila achas shekosav. It's even one word that you've written. An amazing statement. In my humble opinion, you made an enormous mistake in this. Or the author made an enormous mistake in this. And the conclusion of the author is very serious. It's a stumbling block for the public. But it's a deraisa in the Torah Parish, and Rahman it's on Hashem to protect us from that. So if you ever get a letter like that from a senior Pesak, I suppose you just sort of curl up in the corner and cry. But there's a reason why Asher Weiss has been so heavy around this. Again, let's remember Moshe Feinstein's teshuvah, in which he wrote very stridently against junior rabbinical figures who are disagreeing with this, with the prohibition of electricity. The Poskim, the senior Poskim, felt very, very strongly around this matter, and they felt that when it comes to cutting-edge technology of this sort, this is not a matter for every Tom, Dick, and Harry to post their views. This is a very serious issue and has to be dealt with exceptionally seriously. Now, the thrust of what Reb Asher Weiss writes is that you, Mr. Pamphlet author, wanted to argue that with LED, if you look at the very top line, Herech Kavodo, this is page 1, the middle of the page, after the little opening blurb, Herech Kavodo, his honor, wrote at length, as far with reason, and similarly brought from many rabbis, to Badlokos Noros LED, Lamadalit, LED, with the lighting of LED lights, reminder, LED lights are lights that don't create any heat and any glowing filaments. There's no Isotorah, not even a rabbinical prohibition. And it's just weekday type activity. You're so devoted, and the basis of his words, your words are, Al Pidivre Achronim. By the way, he's writing here to the author of the pamphlets, he's just writing them in the third person. Based on the words of the later authorities, they wrote, you're not allowed to complete a circuit on Shabbos, light a electric device. For 2 reasons. Monad, which we saw from the Beis Yitzchak, from the Yitzchak Shmalkus, we saw that, and Mishum Boner, because a building like the Chazon Ish. And he says over here that he disagrees there's no Molid because you don't find Molid in creating light, and we don't have to create a new takana. And the final paragraph in the first column, there's no Boner because it's like opening and closing a door. And then he says at the top of the next column, Velonis Karya Data, your mind didn't cool down. In other words, you've got such an agenda to convince that there's no prohibition that you're only satisfied when you were convinced that you had argued that there's no other prohibition over here. And then he carries on. The second line, the end of the second line in column 2. In addition to that, your svara, your reasoning, your conclusion, maskanazu, is a double amputee, a quadruple amputee. It doesn't have arms or legs. In other words, it's completely helpless. It doesn't have arms to do anything. It doesn't have legs to take us anywhere. It's flawed from its very foundation. It's also very serious because you're going to cause people, people are going to come to use these lights based upon your lighting of the prohibition, and that will have a terrible consequence. And then he says, if we go to the final paragraph on page 1, in the second column, if we get to the core issue, for more than 100 years, as soon as people began using the force of electricity for various things, this has been a discussion amongst the great figures of Yisrael for 100 years. And therefore, how can you uproot what's a 100-year discussion from the greatest of the great? The MS Yoredako, truth shows its path. There's a lot of pilpul, there's a lot of discussion. You could have it all about the svaras, as indeed a commercial Asamaran Hagan of Shem Zalman Obach, etc. So he says there's much halachic debate that can be had. Nonetheless, and these are the crucial words, anyone who wants to come out with a lenient conclusion, has removed himself from the halachic community of Israel. Okay, let's turn over to the next page, and I'm going to unpick what this line means. It's as if a heavenly voice has come out from heaven, that there is the risk of a melacha d'oraisa. So just give me 1 second. Okay, so just to summarize what he said so far, is that there's been 100 years of halachic literature spilt on this, and amazingly, all the Gedolei Yisrael have come out that it's Osa for different reasons, but they are sure it's Osa. And even though you can quibble, you can question, you can argue, every single one thinks it's Osa for different reasons. And he says that as a result, anyone who wants to come along in the year 2022 and say there's no prohibition is taking themselves out of the klal. One has to attach oneself to the chain of transmission of Torah, and there is a buskol, a heavenly voice almost, that's being heard by all the great Poskim saying this is Asa, and that this is a possible Melacha d'oraisa. And if you aren't of the stature where you hear this halachic voice coming out, there's your problem, but don't argue with it. That's number one, the first point of what he says, and I will get back to that to explain what it means. All I want to point out is that in poetic manner, he has said something very similar to what Ramosha Feinstein says, and to the best of my knowledge, he doesn't reference it, and maybe he saw it, maybe he didn't, I don't know. But it's interesting just the parallel of what he's saying, because Ramosha Feinstein also said, I don't know exactly what Malacha it is, but it's definitely a Malacha, and we have to work out which Malacha it is. A remarkable statement. The second part of what Rav Asher Weiss is going to say is he's going to argue that he thinks it is Makkeh BePatish based upon the Yerushalmi that we saw. So here, I'm going to take the question, because I see one of you wants to ask a question, and then we are going to relook at the Yerushalmi. I'm going to stop reading Rav Asher Weiss inside, and we're going to relook at the Yerushalmi, and we're going to see what he says it means.
A normative way of talking to say kind of, we're not having a logical discussion almost. This is like, we're not exactly sure what to point it on, but this is definitely chashash d'oraisa and don't discuss it. Is that like, does that often come up, or is this quite an exceptional?
It's absolutely exceptional, and I want in this shir to bring out why the Poskim are speaking this way, because it's not normal Pesak, Posic language. Why are they being so definitive about it, and what's the point they're getting so across? By the way, they don't say don't discuss it. And they don't say don't debate it. They say don't come to a conclusion that it is not a Melacha D'Oraisa. It definitely is a Melacha D'Oraisa. We just need a lot of discussion to work out which one, and we're not sure which one, but it is a Melacha D'Oraisa. This is very unusual, and I want you to understand why this is happening over here. That's really the punchline of what I want to achieve in this Shiur on electricity. When I was asked to speak about electricity, this to me is the most important conclusion. Let's go back to the Talmud Yerushalmi in source 2 and have a look at it, because there's a major misunderstanding around these topics, and this is really what I wanted to, I feel like a very important need to share. So we're turning back to page 1 on source 2, and again, as I said, my Rosh Hashiva said this, other people said it's a very important point. When we read the Yerushalmi, it says the following. It says, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish learned for 3.5 years the Sukkos of Melacha, and they came out with 39 subcategories, told us, to each of the others. Then it says those that they found which they could attach to one of the other 38 others they did, and any left over that they couldn't attach anywhere, they attached to Makkeh BePatish. So Rav Asher Weiss says two things. Number one, it doesn't sound like when you're trying to work out a Toldot, you are doing this top down. And as we think, the Torah delineated 39 melachas. Now we need to derive from them subcategories. So the Torah said, don't plant a tree. We derive from that pruning a tree, which causes it to grow better, would be a Toldot, would be a subcategory. The Torah says, don't plant a seed. We derive from that watering a seed would be a subcategory of that. Says Rav Asher Weiss, maybe sometimes it works like that, but not always. Because what you see they did when Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish was, they learned through what are melachas. There's a bigger lomdus at work here, a bigger halachic concept at work here, which is, what is a melacha? A melacha is a creative activity. There's certain creative activities which are so obviously powerful and creative that they must be a melacha. Not because we see them as emerging from one of the 39 categories, but the other way around. They're a creative, massive human achievements of the world, and therefore they must be a melacha. We now need to work out which category of melacha they fit into. And Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish had this enormous project, 3.5 years, in which time they identified numerous Toldos, and they slotted in all these Toldos into the Av, which father category, which parent category they fitted into. In other words, there's a chelek, I'll come to it in a second, there's a chelek of Torah we're missing. We think that the way to learn Hilchos Shabbos, the way that Tanaim and Amoraim learn Hilchos Shabbos, is they learned the others, and then what derives from them? What is a logical subcategory within that? Torah says don't sow. Logically, gluing would be the same. It's not true. Maybe sometimes they did that, but sometimes they did the opposite direction of travel. They didn't start top down, looking at 39 and drawing down from that. They started bottom up. What is a melacha? What in human achievement is clearly a significant outcome that crosses the threshold of being so significant that it's a melacha, so creative that it must be a melacha, and now we work out which one of the 39 it fits into. Sorry, you wanted to ask a question.
Sorry, so it means they weren't learning the Mishnah for 3 years. They were learning, like looking at life and then seeing what actions fit into it, or were they learning it from, like, where were they learning the Toldot?
Not necessarily the Mishnah. Gemara isn't just analysis of the Mishnah. Gemara is understanding and reasoning that the Mishnah reveals to us. So the Mishnah reveals to us that there's others and Toldos. So now what is a Toldot? What is a subcategory? So now they considered human activity, and there were certain human activities which were so clearly to them significant and creative and important that they learned that. Now, we don't know the exact criteria. However, this is what they did. This is the first point of what we see in the Yerushalmi. The second point we see in the Yerushalmi is that there are certain creative activities which don't fit any of the other 38 father categories, parent categories, any of the other 38 melachas. But on occasion, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish was so sure that this is a creative and significant achievement and human endeavor, that it must be a melacha, that they said all of these fit in to Makkeh BePatish. In other words, the logic of Makkeh BePatish, the last hammer blow, is that even though it's no other melacha, it's just the final hammer blow that straightens out the silver cup. It's the last hammer blow that blows up the flat pack football and makes it into a balloon. It's the last breaking of the detaching of the chopsticks. What other melacha is it? There's no other discernible melacha, but clearly it's significant and creative because it completes something. Something goes from nothing to something. It becomes usable. It kicks into life. It comes alive at that point. And that's the definition of the Melacha Makkeh BePatish. So Makkeh BePatish is the Melacha of something coming to existence, being creatively produced by human activity, even though it's not any of the other creative activities. It's not a loaf of bread that goes from dough to baked, which is ofer. It's not two pieces of cloth which are now sewn together and therefore joined. Not two threads that are woven together to make a piece of cloth. There's not a seed that's sown that now can grow into something, but it's a different form of something coming to existence. That is Makkeh BePatish. That's the second point you see in the Yerushalmi. Anything they couldn't fit into the senior categories is Makkeh BePatish. So here we come to the most essential and important punchline of what Reb Oshawai says, and really is alluded to in the amazing words of Moshe Feinstein. Both of them are saying similar language. Moshe is saying, I'm convinced this is a Melacha. I need to research exactly, I need to ask exactly which Melacha. When is he going to research this, Moshe? He doesn't tell us. Is he ever going to get the answer? He doesn't know. But he knows that it is a Melacha, because the creation of electrical current is too significant not to be a Melacha. It's, or at least a possibility of Melacha. For 2,000 years, since the demise of the Gemara, Poskim never considered, to the best of my knowledge, a new activity and said this is so clearly creative and wonderful and magical and something new coming to the world, there must be a Melacha. We don't have the normal. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish did that project. They were Amoraim, the great Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. They were Amoraim from the Talmud Yerushalmi, as we discussed. They did that project of defining new melachas, which are Toldot, which again not top down by saying what is this a subcategory of, but bottom up. This is a human achievement that must be so significant that it's a melacha. They did that massive task of defining for us what not just are the Avos Melachas, the 39 Avos Melachas, but also what are the 1,500, etc. Told us that exist. That was their marathon task. Then, in the year 1850, 1870, 1900, all the way through to 2020, suddenly something new comes on the scene. And for the first time, Poskim have to weigh in, is this a Melacha? Some of them think they can get their bottom down. Mavi, Mavashel, you can look at the Melachas and work out which one of it is a subcategory of. Other Poskim say, you know what, we're not entirely sure, especially when it's not making heat and it's not glowing red hot, which Melacha it is. But we are convinced, having learned the Sukkah of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, having considered what defines something as a Melacha, that this is a Melacha. Now we have to work out which subcategory it's a subcategory of. Maybe it's boner, maybe it's not. The truth is not such a big nafkamina. Really nafkamina between which categories of Melachas things fall in is with respect to bringing korbanos in the base mikdash, we have to do the shuvah. It doesn't make a difference. A Toldot is deraisa and Avot is deraisa. Which Avot is which Toldot is doesn't make such a difference in practical halacha. This is so creative, it must be a Melacha. Says Ramosha, it's definitely a Melacha. Which one it is, it needs further research. We'll either get there or not. It could be boner, and you know what? If it's not boner, it'll be Makkeh BePatish. The Chazon Ish says the same thing. It's either it's boner, it's Makkeh BePatish. We're much right stuff. I think it's Makkeh BePatish because the world comes to us and we can't fit it into any other category. It'll be Makkeh BePatish. Makkeh BePatish means a significant outcome of creating something new. The Rambam says that because this is the Melacha of Roifim, it's the achievement of doctrines. It's a creative act that doctrines do. Opening a hole in a pus wound, that was source 3 that we saw, is called Makkeh BePatish. So any creative, significant achievement that I'm bringing into existence, that's Makkeh BePatish. Don't ask me what thresholds we cross of how much creativity is needed. That's the job of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, and on rare occasions, the consensus of all the Gedolei HaPoskim. So it's difficult to weigh up what crosses the threshold of creativity. But interestingly, says Rabbi Osha, all the great Poskim we looked at this, Father Aruch HaShulchan, all came to the conclusion that this was a Melacha, even though they couldn't identify necessarily or even agree upon which of the other Melachas it is. This is why both Reb Moshe Feinstein and Reb Osher Weiss slam the more junior posek who can't hear this. They're saying there's many areas in which a Rav of a shul, posek, can pass Shabbos. By the way, there's a myth out there. Not every Rav passes Shabbos, but there's a myth out there. And when we look at Pesak, we'll talk about this. That a lower tier posek never does anything. They just apply that which the senior posek say. Not true. A Rav who's being asked Shabbos can be paskin in genuine creative Pesak halacha tens of times a day. However, there are levels of shyness which are a shikol hadas, a weighing up, and to do a once in a 2,000 year project of being sure that something is a new melacha, that creating electric circuitry is so creative and so significant that it must be a melacha. That's a project which only the collective wisdom of tens of the greatest poskim agree to. And amazingly, they all agreed to this. They all came to the same conclusion. that this is a melacha, this is such a creative activity that bottom up, starting from the basics, it must be melacha, and now we have to work out which melacha it is. And this is why Reb Asher and Moshe both use this language of this is this is for the Gedolei Poskim, this is like a buskol that came out. It's something that all the Poskim heard. It's not something that has logical proof. I can't prove to you it's a melacha. If you say to me, how creative does it need to be? We don't have a scale of creativity. If it's from 1 to 6, it's not a melacha. If it's from 6 to 10, it is a melacha. We don't have a vocabulary to talk about this. They just understood, they intuited that electricity coming on the scene was a massive change to society. And this was such a significant change to society. It was something completely new that had appeared on the scene. This is a melacha. It's too radical a departure. For 2,000 years, no one discussed this. For 2,000 years, we left the project of defining melachas for 3,500 years, the Torah. There'd never been a Torah of electricity in the world. And now something new has come upon the scene, and it's our job as Poskim in the 1800s and 1900s to Poskim it, and we are convinced this is a new and creative act. It's a wonderful thing. This is what he means by this language of buskol coming out. Now, I just want to spell out what that means, because number one, we are witnessing the birth of a Chiddush Torah, a genuine new piece of Torah. I don't know what Moshe Rabbeinu knew or didn't know, but certainly, as far as we understand, Rabbi Kiva, Hillel, Abaye, Rava, none of them knew the Torah of electricity because they didn't know what electricity was. So new Torah came into existence as this Pesak was made. It's a remarkable thing. There's a new piece of Torah in existence, the Torah Sachashmal, the Torah of electricity. That's number one. Number two, amazingly, all the Poskim, all the senior Poskim, with the exception of the Aruch HaShulchan to a degree, all heard this buskol. They all heard a voice come out from Sinai saying, "Thou shalt not create electricity on Shabbos." How they heard it, the vehicle, the medium through which they heard it, each had their own halachic view. But they heard that this has to be a melacha, an amazing thing. So that's the second point. The third point, and to me this is the magic of halacha, and for me one of the we all think about what makes us a mamin, and for me one of the pillars of my emunah is the magic of halacha. That halacha works. That halacha can offer a spiritual path, an opportunity to transcendence, something meaning, something moral, something that ties into human needs and spirituality, family, community, respect for others, learning, literacy, emotional health, achievement, the divine, touching infinity, carrying out things of absolute worth. Halacha provides an opportunity for that, a framework for that, in every society. Perhaps the four of us sitting here in this room, this virtual room, could design a system that could offer meaningful life in 2022. But would it offer a meaningful life in 3022? Would it offer a meaningful life even in 200 years' time? Absolutely not. It could be designed for our world. We have our Halachic system, which worked under the Romans, it worked under the Greeks, it worked in Bavel, it worked in Eretz Israel, it worked in East Europe and Russian persecution, it worked in North Africa, and it works in 2022. And with all the flaws in the Jewish world, in every world within which it exists, it offers a society that has better communal attachment, better morality on average, greater tzedakah giving, respect for people, and the things that all societies value. Now, to me, this is the one of the wonders of Jewish history. Because in the year 1880, when people were looking at electricity, they were not thinking of electronic detox and Shabbat UK. They were not thinking of emails and social media and smartphones that would hound and persecute us and drive out family time and community time and the distraction that it brings. They were thinking of flickering, light bulbs in a hovel in East Europe and North Africa. Maybe they were beginning to think about fridges that were just coming on the scene. They had this ability. Now, if they were engaged in social policy, they would have embraced this. If they would have said, what's Shabbos? What does Shabbos feel like to us? If they would have used the tools of machshava and sentiment, they would have said, these are wonderful devices to use. They can keep your food cold on Shabbos. They can give you light on Shabbos. Light is a wonderful thing. But they didn't do that because it's not how we make decisions in Judaism. We make decisions by using dry, legal reasoning. We don't, at least consciously, and very often even subconsciously, you think about social policy. Occasionally a Poskim will think about that, most of the time not. We just apply the classic texts. And applying classic reasoning, they came to the conclusion that turning on a fridge engine, lighting a flickering light bulb is awesome. No one at the time dreamt that electrical devices would ruin the potential for Shabbos. We now fast forward to the year 2022, and we realize what saves Shabbos is the ban on using a smartphone, the ban on social media. That's the essence of perhaps the most fundamental part of Shabbos that we connect to. That's what allows us to Friday night meal with family. That allows us to see our grandparents on Shabbos. It allows us to go to shul and have kahila mixing. It allows us to engage in Talmud Torah. It allows us to switch off from the pressure of the week. The most important element in Shabbos still being Shabbos is this Pesak. And no one made this Pesak 100 years ago because they dreamt about Facebook and Twitter. No one made it 100 years ago because they dreamt about smartphone addiction. So dry halachic reasoning led the Poskim to hear a bus call coming out saying, "Thou shalt not use electricity on Shabbos," and they all heard that voice come out from Sinai. And then they disagreed about what's the voice saying, what's the lomtus behind this decree of Hashem. But they all heard the Dvar Hashem saying, "Don't use it on Shabbos," and therefore came to the halachic conclusion. This is the beauty of what the Chazon Ish is telling us. And he says it's either Avot Melacha BePatish, or Moshe says, I don't know which one it is. It's Avot Melacha BePatish or some Melacha, but it has to be some Melacha. This is what Rabbi Shiur tells us when he talks about this. But I want to tell you, for me, the metaphor of the giving Torah is the Torah being given is like a stone being dropped in a pond. And there's ripples that emerge from that pond. And it is true that as you get further and further away, and as time passes, the ripples become fainter. If you have a very sensitive detector, you can still hear a ripple from Sinai. You can still hear a particle coming out from Sinai. And those who have sensitive ripple detectors, the greatest of the Poskim, hear those ripples. And a ripple was heard in the modern era. And the ripple that they heard from the stone being dropped in the ponds of Sinai was, as I said, a bus call that came out saying, "Don't use electricity on Shabbos." Like any other Posuk in the Torah, there's plenty of room to argue. What are the parameters? When does it work? When doesn't it work? What's the nature of this? What's the lomdus? Which Melacha it is? But they all heard the bus call. That's what Ramosha Feinstein is telling us. That's what the Shiur of Moshe is telling us. As I mentioned, my Rabbi Yitzchak Soloveitchik said, this is what the Gedolei HaPoskim, the Gedolei HaLamdanim have heard from Sinai. And this is how to make sense of this very strange teshuvah, as I mentioned, of Ramosha, which makes very strange reading, this very strange introduction of the use of electricity. Now, I'll pause here in case there are any questions. Then I want to say one final halachic point, but just to check if there's anything anyone wants to ask on this, and then I'll say one final halachic conclusion.
So firstly, I was busy in the other room with the base medrash, but that was the 50 minutes I got unbelievable. Just a quick question. Jacqueline was talking about the loop in a shul for people with hearing aids to connect to. Is that not a quick question?
Okay, so very briefly, very important question. Despite my eloquent statements about electrical use, at the end of the day, there is a tentativeness around what modern Poskim are saying. And they are all saying, we think it is a Melacha. We hear this bus call coming out, but at the end of the day, it's treat it as a deraisa. However, in certain extenuating circumstances and emergency circumstances, especially if we can chip away at our suggestions of what this ban on electricity means, things can get a little easier. And this is where where there is room for some moderation. And the general rule of thumb of the Poskim is that we will treat it as a deraisa l'chatchila, but in shasat achak, like medical or security emergencies, since at the end of the day it's a bus call that we've heard, but tentatively heard, and since there's many variants of defining exactly what the issue is, we will be more lenient. So, for example, over our tour of electricity, we discussed some nafkaminas. We said even if turning on an electric current is a problem, maybe turning off isn't, because something cooling down isn't a melacha. What happens if it's designed to be opened and closed? Maybe that's a bit more like a door. What happens if the current is always running and you're just strengthening and weakening the current? Is that the same? What happens when it doesn't create a loud voice and therefore your action isn't recognizable to anyone but the listener, like with a loop or a hearing aid? What happens when you're indirectly triggering? You're not doing an action by pressing a button, but you're just triggering it with your voice. So in a situation where there's a significant need, like the inability of a deaf person to hear, or an emergency security situation in a hospital, in the army in Israel, or in a hospital, and there are other mitigating factors, like you're doing it with your voice, not with your hands, it's strengthening and weakening a current rather than turning a current on and off, and therefore maybe that's not as creative, it's not a new force you're bringing into the world, you're simply channeling an existing force. In those cases, the Poskim will be lenient. So as much as I've spoken about this bus call that came out and the importance of understanding what the concept means in halacha, I eagerly want to say it can't stop there. Obviously, it's now the job of the Poskim, and in this respect, even more junior Poskim sometimes, to work out, okay, but what are the exact parameters? And therefore, in a serious situation, it's one thing for a Moshe to say, I'm sure it's a halacha, and I don't know exactly which one and exactly the parameters as a broad statement of halacha. But when I'm pushed to actually now work out for this individual who otherwise would be deaf, for this security situation in an army base in Israel, for this hospital emergency, and a doctor needs a Pesak, that's when we'll have to fine tune the Sorah, and that's where there will be disagreement between the Poskim as to exactly how to channel the Sorah. That's the basis of leniencies in some situations. Okay, so that brings us to, I think, enough of a halachic conclusion out of all of this. And as I said, it does begin touching on Pesak Halacha and some of the things that I wanted to say around Pesak Halacha. I'm going to speak to Shelby off group and see if we can find time to also try and do something around the remaining issues of Pesak Halacha. But for this section of the Shiur, I think we're finished. And also, just to tell me, Shelby, everyone, did you finish the source sheets for today, or have you not yet started them, or you finished for today?
We finished them.
Okay, so maybe next week then, if nothing else, I'll do a short share on Oneg Shabbos, Kovod Shabbos, and Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos. And this was, by the way, not an attempt to conclude the whole of Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos. There's an enormous amount to talk about. I say that simply.
We thought maybe it was an attempt to encourage us to go back home and make Shabbos.
Also that. The halachas of Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos are very complicated. I simply say that to say that you shouldn't tick it off your list. So whoever is giving you continues with the Shiur next term, if they ever suggest Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos, don't say yes, we've done it. You haven't done it, but I want to bring out one feature of Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos for these thought sheets. So I'll speak to you off group about maybe next week trying to do Hadlakas Neiros Shabbos and maybe also something around Pesak. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies, I wish you good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Bye bye.
Thank you.